South Korea built a national museum for one side dish. Not a festival, not a restaurant. A museum with research-level detail and a UNESCO stamp. And it's for kimchi, fermented cabbage. So what's the real reason Seoul needs a kimchi museum? And what are they so determined to protect inside it? Here's something most people get completely wrong about kimchi. They think it's just a condiment, a side dish, something you push to the corner of your plate and maybe try once on a dare. But walk into any Korean home, and kimchi isn't sitting in the corner. It's everywhere, in the fridge, in clay pots buried underground, in conversations at the dinner table, in arguments between grandmothers about whose recipe is better. It's not a side dish, it's a way of life. And Korea decided the world needed to understand that. So they built the Kimchi Museum in Seoul. Now, you might be thinking, okay, a food museum, sure. But this isn't just a quirky tourist attraction with some jars on display. This museum holds over 1,000 years of cultural history. It documents more than 200 distinct varieties of kimchi. It runs scientific research on fermentation.
And it was literally created to fight back against a cultural threat that South Korea saw coming decades ago. So here's what we're going to uncover today. We'll reveal the 1,000-year origin story Korea refuses to let disappear. We'll expose the International Kimchi War that changed everything. We'll explain exactly why UNESCO got involved. And we'll show you what this fermented cabbage actually tells us about how identity survives or doesn't in the modern world. Stay with me, because this story is far bigger than a bowl of vegetables. Let's go back, way back, to around 37 BCE, when the first records of fermented vegetables appear in Korean history, according to the National Folk Museum of Korea. Now, early kimchi looked nothing like what you'd recognize today. No chili peppers, no red color, just salted vegetables preserved for winter, because that's what this was originally, survival technology. Korea has brutal winters. Fresh vegetables disappear for months. Fermentation was the solution. You salt the vegetables, the bacteria do their work, and suddenly you have a food that lasts for months and actually gets more nutritious over time. Think about that. This wasn't just cooking.
This was ancient biotechnology. Then, around the 16th century, everything changed. Portuguese traders brought chili peppers to Asia. Koreans absorbed them into kimchi. And the red, spicy, deeply complex kimchi we know today was born. But here's the part that most people miss. Kimchi didn't just feed Korea, it unified Korea. Every region developed its own recipe. Jeolla province made it rich and bold. Northern regions, near what is now North Korea, made it milder with less chili. Coastal regions added seafood. Over 200 distinct regional varieties evolved, each one carrying the identity of a specific place, a specific family, a specific generation. This is why Korean grandmothers don't just make kimchi, they perform kimchi. They pass down a living inheritance. And the Kimchi Museum in Seoul exists specifically to preserve every single one of those 200 variations before they disappear. Now here's where the story gets remarkably intense, and this is the part that actually explains why the museum exists at all. In the 1990s, Korea watched something terrifying happen. Japan started exporting a product called kimchi, their own version of fermented cabbage, and it was flooding international markets.
By 1996, according to the Korea Agro-Fisheries Trade Corporation, Japan had captured roughly 70% of the global kimchi export market. Let that sink in. Korea's most sacred food, a food Koreans had been making for over 1,000 years, was being commercially dominated by another country. And it wasn't stopping there. Chinese manufacturers entered the market with cheaper versions. International food companies started labeling their products kimchi with no connection to Korean tradition whatsoever. Korea felt like it was watching its identity get photocopied and sold back to the world at a discount. So Korea fought back, not with politics, not with trade tariffs, but with knowledge. They began systematically documenting everything: the history, the science, the regional variations, the traditional fermentation methods. They funded research, they organized the culinary heritage, and they launched what would eventually become the push for UNESCO recognition. The Kimchi Museum in Seoul became the physical headquarters of that cultural defense mission. It wasn't just a museum, it was a statement. This belongs to us, and we can prove it. Does that change how you see a jar of kimchi sitting in a grocery store? Because it should.
In 2013, UNESCO added Kimjang to its representative list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity. Now, what exactly is Kimjang? It's the traditional Korean practice of making and sharing kimchi together as a community. Every autumn, before the first frost, Korean families and neighbors gathered to make enormous batches of kimchi together. Hundreds of heads of cabbage, hours of preparation. And then, and this is the part that reveals something extraordinary about Korean culture, they share it with everyone. Neighbors, elderly people who live alone, anyone who needs it. UNESCO didn't just recognize kimchi as food. They recognized Kimjang as a system of social solidarity, a community ritual that actively fights isolation and inequality. According to UNESCO's official documentation, Kimjang reaffirms Korean identity and strengthens the spirit of cooperation. Think about that analogy for a moment. Kimjang is basically Korea's annual operating system update, the moment where the entire society reboots its connections to each other. And the Kimchi Museum in Seoul now holds the definitive record of that tradition. It documents how Kimjang has been practiced across different centuries, different regions, different social classes.
It preserves recipes donated by families whose grandmothers are no longer alive. It holds the memory of a practice that, without active protection, could quietly disappear in just 2 or 3 generations of urban life. Because here's the uncomfortable reality. Urbanization is already disrupting Kimjang. Young Koreans in Seoul apartments increasingly buy kimchi from stores instead of making it together. The museum isn't just celebrating a tradition, it's racing to archive one before it's gone. So here's the question this entire story has been building toward. Why does a country build a museum for food? The obvious answer is cultural pride. But the real answer is something deeper and more universal than that. Every culture on Earth has a food that carries its entire identity. France has its bread, so central that the French government passed a law in 1993 literally regulating how it must be made. Mexico has corn, a crop so sacred that indigenous communities still perform ceremonial rituals around it dating back 5,000 years. And Korea has kimchi, a fermented living food that has survived invasions, colonization, modernization, and international commercial competition. When Korea built the Kimchi Museum in Seoul, they were doing something extremely specific. They were declaring that their identity is not for sale, that it cannot be replicated without context, that you cannot separate the food from the history, the community, the ritual, and the grandmother who taught you exactly how much garlic was enough. Here's what's remarkably interesting about the science, too. Kimchi contains lactobacillus bacteria, the same probiotic strains now found in premium health supplements sold globally for up to $40 a bottle. Korean communities were consuming these bacteria daily for 1,000 years before the wellness industry discovered them. According to a 2013 study published in the Journal of Medicinal Food, kimchi demonstrates antimicrobial, antioxidant, and anti-inflammatory properties. Korea didn't just preserve a food, they accidentally preserved one of history's most sophisticated natural health technologies, and the museum documents that science alongside the culture. Because they understood something that most countries don't.
When you lose the story of where your food comes from, you lose a piece of who you are. And that loss is completely irreversible. So, does your culture have a food that carries your entire identity like this? Say it in the comments. I genuinely want to know. And if this story made you see kimchi, or any food, differently? Because next, we're uncovering why France made bad bread completely illegal in 1993, and the one law that proves food can actually be a matter of national survival. Don't miss it.